people think about wealth, they usually think about billionaires, right? Names like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, or ancient kings covered in gold, right? Well, what if I told you that one of the richest empires in human history wasn't in Europe? It wasn't in Asia, and it definitely wasn't in America. It was in Africa. Long before, colonial borders, long before transatlantic slave trade. Man, it gets deep, bro. Look, long before Africa was divided on European maps, right? There was an empire so wealthy that people across the known world had heard about it. An empire built on trade, right? Knowledge, leadership, and one of the most valuable resources on earth, right? Gold. That empire was Mali, right? And once you learned about it, you can start realizing just how much history we were never taught. Because if somebody asks you to picture medieval Africa, what comes to mind? For a lot of people, nothing, right? Maybe a desert. Maybe scattered villages. Maybe images they've seen in movies, right? But that's not what West Africa looked like hundreds of years ago, bro. Nah, the Mali Empire was one of the largest and the most organized states on the planet. It stretched across west areas of West Africa and controlled important trade routes connecting like forests, like savannas, right, and the Sahara Desert. Those trade routes weren't just roads, bro. They were the highways of the medieval world, bro. That's facts, man. Caravans carrying salt, gold, copper, books, bro, cloth, and ideas travel for weeks across the desert. Think about that for a second, bro. Every caravan that passed through Mali helped make the empire stronger. Gold was everywhere. West Africa produced a large share of the world's known gold during this period. Hey, how you doing, bro? The wealth helped support cities, governments, and international trade. But Mali wasn't built on gold alone. It was built on organization, strong leadership, agriculture, commerce, relationships with neighboring kingdoms. Right? One of the empire's greatest rulers were Sundiata Keita. According to tradition, he united rival territories and laid the foundation for what will become one of Africa's greatest empires. His story has been preserved for like centuries, by griots, oral historians who carry history from like one generation to the next. Think about that for a second, bro. Long before microphones, bro. Long before cameras, long before internet, history was being remembered through people whose responsibility was to preserve the past. Right? That tradition helped keep the story of Mali alive. As the empire grew, cities became centers of trade and learning, right? Places like Timbuktu and Jenin attracted merchants from across Africa and beyond. People didn't only travel there to buy and sell, they came to study, man. To teach, to exchange ideas. Libraries grew, scholars debated mathematics, astronomy, law, medicine, philosophy, and religion. For many people, that completely changes the picture. They began about medieval Africa, right? Because this wasn't an isolated part of the world, it was connected, dynamic, and respected. Then came the ruler, whose name would travel farther than anyone else's, right? Mansa Musa. His pilgrims to Mecca became legendary, right? Historical accounts described an enormous caravan that crossed the Sahara, carrying attendants, official soldiers, and large quantities of gold. His generosity became so famous that later writers described gold becoming more plentiful in some places after his visit. Though historians continue to debate the exact economic impact, whether every detail is perfectly accurate or not, one thing is clear. This journey introduced much of the wider world to the power of wealth of Mali. But here's something I think gets overlooked. Mansa Musa didn't create the empire from nothing. He inherited a kingdom that generations before him had already built. Right? Too often, we remember one famous leader and forget the people who made greatness possible. The farmers, the traders, right? The blacksmiths, right? The builders, right? The teachers, the families, right? The generations who laid each stone before history before. Remember one king, right? And as a black person learning about Mali, it's differently, man. Because it reminds you that our history didn't begin with survival. It also includes achievement, man. Innovation, bro. Leadership, bro. Learning. And prosperity. The Mali Empire wasn't perfect. No civilization is. Like every great empire faced political struggles, secessions, disputes, and change of trade patterns. Over time, its influence declined as neighboring powers grew stronger and trade routes shifted. But decline doesn't erase accomplishments. Today, the story of Mali is still written in manuscripts, archaeological sites, oral traditions, and the memories of communities that continue to preserve their heritage. So when someone says Africa has no great civilizations before Europe arrived, remember Mali. Remember the scholars. Shit, remember the caravans crossing the Sahara. Remember the cities filled with books. Remember the gold that connected continents. And remember that one of the richest and most influential empires in history rose from Africa's soil. Because that's part of black history. Pay attention to that. And that's the story the world deserves to know, right?